Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have invited a very important lecturer from DOE. Professor Sofronis, our director of I²CNER, was supposed to be the host for today's lecture, Dr. Monterey Gardiner. But Professor Sofronis changed his visit schedule to the I²CNER, so I chaired today's lecture for our director. Some of the audiences may know that Dr. Gardiner has already visited Kyushu University a few years ago to give a lecture at the Fukuoka International Hydrogen Energy Development Forum. Every year we have this. And Dr. Gardiner knows our activity on hydrogen research. I prepared long introduction for Dr. Gardiner. Probably the longest introduction in this I²CNER series because he's a very important man. It may be too long, but I believe it is very important for many young researchers and students because they may meet Dr. Gardiner in the near future in different places in the US and Japan, probably in Europe, in the hydrogen energy or renewable energy societies. Dr. Gardiner obtained all his degrees from UC Davis, Bachelor of Arts, German, in 1997, a Bachelor of Science on Materials Science Engineering, 1997, Master of Science on Transportation Technology and Policy in 2002, a PhD on Transportation Technology and Policy in 2004. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Gardiner has been working in the area of hydrogen and fuel cells. These areas of work include academia, industry, US government, and Japanese government positions. Dr. Gardiner has also worked in industry with Hyundai America Technical Center to manage their fleet of fuel cell vehicles in Northern California. At least one vehicle was driven nearly to 20,000 miles throughout Northern California in Sacramento and the San Francisco Bay Area. At the California Fuel Cell Partnership, Dr. Gardiner was the hydrogen safety engineer and worked in public outreach and trained over 400 first responders to respond safely to hydrogen vehicle accidents. Dr. Gardiner was also responsible for the sharing of safety learnings between local, state, and federal officials regarding hydrogen safety and best practices. These learnings were also shared internationally. At DOE, Dr. Gardiner was responsible for planning and developing program target for the hydrogen delivery subprogram. In addition to delivery, Dr. Gardiner managed the Hydrogen Storage Engineering Center of Excellence, which consists of a 5-year effort involving 10 automotive manufacturers, national laboratories, and university and industry. During this time, Dr. Gardiner also managed the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories project around high-pressure, low-temperature hydrogen storage, which is the only storage system projected to date to meeting both DOE's volume and weight system target for 2017. BMW is planning on using this technology in their next hydrogen car, and will develop a rolling prototype next year. Currently, Dr. Gardiner is in the last year of a 2-year Mike Mansfield fellowship. The first year involved intense Japanese language and culture classes in DC, followed by a 6-week homestay in Kanazawa. Dr. Gardiner spent 5 months at METI, Keizai Sangyo Sho, METI, in their international department, and we spent 5 months at NEDO in their smart community department and renewable energy department. Dr. Gardiner also spent 2 weeks at IEEJ's Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, developing information on the residential fuel cell technology status for their APEC 2011 Energy Outlook review publication. This fall, Dr. Gardiner will return to the DOE fuel cell technology program. Dr. Gardner's hobbies include dangerous sports such as snow camping, hang gliding, motorcycle racing, and scuba diving. You all know that all these sports are more dangerous than hydrogen cars. So please, Monterey.
Thank you very much, Murakami-san, for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their afternoon to come listen to me talk a little bit about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've tried to be an objective in the information I've provided here as far as letting people make their own decisions, but I'm hoping at the end of this talk that people here will have a better understanding of kind of what are the decisions that are being made when a country tries to figure out what they want to do next in terms of energy policy and deciding long-term infrastructure projects that will have multi-decade impacts on the environment, on the economy of that country, and depending on the country, their supply of energy. So I've been to Kyushu probably more times than any other place in Japan. I've been to Aso-san and then Kumamoto and a few other places, so I really like Kyushu. So during this talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and barriers to the implementation of renewable energy and energy policy in general. So anybody here can tell me one of the 3 E's of kind of energy policy? Somebody that's probably everybody here knows them, but who's adventurous enough to tell me one of them? I see somebody smiling with a green shirt. I think that means they want to answer. That's right, protection of the environment. That's one of the 3 E's that comes up quite a bit at NEDO and Keizai Sangyo Sho. Okay, how about somebody else? Close, but we're trying to get the guy with the blue shirt to answer. All right, security of energy supply. That's one of them. And then we got one more. That's part of environment, but the last one I would think is the economy. So how do you ensure that your economy stays strong? Right? If you're paying too much for energy, your industry is a competitive disadvantage compared to other countries. But I think an example of this might be that disproves, I think, that the 3 E's or proves that they're somewhat interrelated. Does anybody here know how much renewable energy Germany currently uses or consumes out of their entire energy or electricity supply? It's been in the newspaper, I think, probably fairly recently. Oh, there's somebody with a white shirt. They raised their hand. Minyo. Hi. So, ドイツの割合の再生可能エネルギーはいくらぐらいですか? You're right, 20%, exactly. And which economy in Oshu は一番強い? なの経済は? なの国の, I think there's 27大ぐらい国の欧州 EU. So, なの国は一番強いですか? Huh? A little bit louder, sorry. Anybody? You with the white shirt. Yeah, which country is strongest? Which country in the 27 countries in the EU has the strongest economy currently, probably? Hi. Hi. Okay. So I think the point I wanted to make here is that the economy and renewable energy, that those can go together. That just because you have a lot of renewable energy doesn't mean your industry has to give up a competitive advantage. So let's move on. So thinking about kind of energy and choosing policy, I'm going to kind of start with environment and then work my way through kind of environment and energy supply, security of supply. But so 450 parts per million, why does this matter? So this is from observatory, the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. You can see that gradually the concentration of CO2 has been just steadily increasing, right? So we're almost to 400 here. This data is from what, May, somewhere on here it says May 7th. So this is fairly recent. So the CO2 now, you can go there. But people will say, okay, so why do I care if we get to 450 ppm? Why is that a problem? Does anybody know what the degree temperature rise is that we're worried about? Oh, there, somebody, the dark blue shirt. 酸化炭素の問題で何の温度はちょっと一番高い数字のは問題が来ますか？今 I think it's on there somewhere. No, actually that's in parts per million. So what temperature rise is what everybody's worried about right now? Do you know? 知っていません? So people are worried about a 2-degree temperature rise, so in terms of global warming and environment. So let me see if I can go on. So if we look at weather from last year, there's a lot of information on here, so I just pick out a couple that I think might be relevant. For 2011, this was the 9th warmest year in 130 some odd years. So if we jump down here and we look at, let's look at Thailand. So July through December of last year, there was a lot of flooding. So everybody remembers that. There was probably information on the news. And it covered almost a third of Thailand's provinces with flooding. And there was a $45 billion cost to that flooding. It was almost 15% of their GDP. I'm curious as to what that impact was for Japan autos industry and technology industry. So I think Toyota, Honda, many other companies had to receive parts and wiring harnesses from Thailand, and because of this flooding, the supply chain was stopped from just-in-time manufacturing. So this cost, this environmental cost, it's not just the environment, it's also the economy. It's very interlinked when you start thinking about the 3 E's. They're not just one single item. In Texas last year, there were over 100 days that were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So this causes a lot of damage in terms of agriculture, for ranching, for animals and so on, and then for the forestry industry as well. So that was $10 billion worth of damage to the Southwest alone. So there's definitely, I think, proof or whatever. I think everywhere except for the US, people have acknowledged global warming as a challenge and a problem. But it's just a matter of trying to think about these problems. It's a tragedy of the economy, right? If somebody pees in the swimming pool, nobody knows about it. If everybody pees in the swimming pool, it's a problem. But until you get people to care about that, it'll be a while. So right now, people are focused on the economic meltdown in Europe right now. China's economy is starting to slow. Japan has been flat for some time. So, but I think that by taking care of this problem, there's an opportunity for growing industry and growing individual regional economies. So IEA has their 2011 World Outlook. So they release this outlook every year. So this is an international energy agency. In the past, this was very focused on energy security, setting up strategic petroleum reserves for the member countries. I don't know, it's 30 some odd countries. And then also looking at nuclear power and ensuring kind of that power is part of the energy mix for most of these countries, or at least supporting kind of calculations for promoting nuclear power versus maybe renewable energy. So you can see they have this 450 ppm scenario. So this is around 30 gigatons of carbon. So they talk about this wiggle room to try to get to that scenario. You can see power generation is the biggest portion of CO2 emissions. We have industry, transport, buildings, and so on. If you come down here and you look at these projections and how are we going to keep this, you can see there's a current scenarios policy where the carbon just keeps going up, and it won't be that far before we do hit that 2-degree temperature rise. You can have maybe some new policies, but really the 450 ppm scenario is going to require a big reduction in emissions. And one of the challenges here is that when you put in a nuclear power plant, I mean, how long does a nuclear power plant generally last? Is it like 30 years, 60 years? 原発発電の I don't know what lifetime は何時間ぐらいかかりますか？はい。
It's a very difficult question to answer.
Right, but 大抵 design structure はいくらぐらい?
Several 10 years.
Right, so about 30 years, 40年ぐらい. But right now, everybody's looking at trying to extend that, right, pushing it out to 60 years. And so if you have a energy infrastructure that you put in place, it's going to be 60 years because people want to make the money on that capital. It's a stranded investment. There's no chance to put new technologies that have improved. So if you look at the cost down of solar modules, they've dropped by 50% in the last 3 years. Part of that is market problems because there's an oversupply of modules because Germany and feed-in tariffs in Spain and so on. But new technologies, renewable energy technologies, every year they're improving. But if you put in a coal power plant that lasts for 40 years, you're stuck with that coal power plant. You can't think about changing your energy infrastructure. So for people that are thinking about energy, this ExxonMobil Energy Outlook is a really nice brochure. You can download it from their website. It talks about the projections for China's coal use. That may level off, I think, in 2030 or so. Just about everywhere else in the world, the use of coal has started to decline. So if you look at natural gas prices in the US, they're at historic lows. I don't think that's sustainable. I'll get to that. But natural gas is definitely looking to be, it's cleaner, it's less costly, there's less environmental problems related to natural gas compared to coal. And one of the most important things is it can load follow much easily renewable energy. So what I'm trying to say is that if you have a coal power plant, you have to run it a minimum of 5,000 hours per year, or it's just not economical. It's better to shut it down, whether it's transporting or storing that coal. And it's almost like a nuclear power plant where you just don't want to turn it off. And so you need to always have some kind of constant output. So what do? If we have a population that's growing rapidly and we're looking at what we have 7 billion people on the planet now, we're moving to 9 billion in the next 30 years, all of that energy use is going to increase. So what do if we're worried about 450 ppm? We think about renewable energy. What can we do? So if you're doing a lot of renewable energy, over here you have megawatts. So you knock off a couple zeros and you get a few zeros and you get gigawatts here. You can just see it's almost, right, it's an exponential curve. It's just, the growth rate is enormous. And a lot of this is driven by Europe, I think, then China. So you can see Spanish wind demand, they've been hitting really, really high percentages of renewable energy coming into their grid. I think they have 5 gigawatt hours of pumped hydro versus 27 gigawatt hours of pumped hydro in Japan. So they have relatively small amount of pumped hydro, but through the entire month of February, wind energy supplied 20% of all of their electricity consumption. And then, in April, so just a few weeks ago, there was a time period of a few hours where it supplied 60% of the energy demand for Spain, for all of their electricity demand. It was 4 in the morning on a Monday or Sunday night, but it shows that the grid operators can manage large amounts of renewable energy coming into the grid. It really comes down to policy and kind of grid codes and more technical issues. There's been several US studies that say for the US grid, you can get upwards of 20% wind energy coming into the grid, and you don't have to pay for anything specifically for the wind. You have voltage regulation, and you have many other needs that are just needed for supplying reliable electricity, whether it's from a coal power plant or a natural gas power plant. And if you have 20% wind, you don't need to do anything special. And this is showing up to 60%, they almost didn't need to do anything, at least for a day. But even in Germany, as you get to more and more, much larger percentages of renewable energy, you really need a strong grid. So you need to be able to move electricity quickly from the northern part of the country where there's a lot of wind to the south, or if the wind's not blowing, there's a lot of sun in Munich and elsewhere, so moving that north. So recently they hit a record here just last week where on a Friday, on a work week, solar provided 33% of all of the electricity needed. And this was from something like from noon to 2 p.m. So it wasn't just a short instant, but it was like in the middle of the day. So very large amounts of renewable energy can come onto the grid. And so this is something like 22 gigawatt hours worth of power, almost 20 nuclear power plants. So it's a lot of renewable energy coming on. In 2011, China installed 18 gigawatts, and they have a plan by 2020 to get to 140 gigawatts. And if you play with the capacity factors, that might come out to 50 gigawatts, which is about the number of gigawatts for Japan's nuclear power that's all been turned off. Anybody here know what a capacity factor is? Utilization? Anybody? Okay, with the red shirt, akai shatsu wa megane. Hi, capacity factor wa. Take a guess, any guess? Utilization rate. I don't know, Nihongo wasuremashita. So capacity factor is using something. So how long do you use it? If you have a power plant, you can't use it 100%. It can't always be on because at some point you have to turn it off for maintenance or you have to take care of some regulation inspection or whatever it happens to be. So you never get 100% capacity factor for anything. For nuclear power, oftentimes when they do a cost estimate, that might be upwards of 90, 95% capacity factor. If you use something a lot, it's cheap because you're using it. But I think in the mid 2000s, there were a lot of new nuclear power plants coming online in Japan, and is it Kobe earthquake? There was an earthquake, and so they had some additional problems. So the overall capacity factor was closer to 60%. If you look at a coal power plant, I think that's maybe 60, 80%. Natural gas has a high capacity factor. It's easier to use. So capacity factor is important when you talk about any energy in order to do a fair comparison. So I'll get to something on the US here in a bit. So talking about US energy consumption, this is a little bit dated from 2009, but you can see petroleum is a pretty big chunk of our energy use. We have natural gas, this is increased, the coal percent's decreased for things that I've talked about. Renewable energy is about 8%, that includes hydro, about the same as nuclear power plants. The US recently approved two gigawatt nuclear power plants in Georgia, and those were the first power plants to be approved in over 30 years. And I think there's another, I don't know, 8 to 10 that are on the drawing boards. But oftentimes these projects have very multi-year delays, and so you have an estimate, well, we can build this in 2 years, 4 years, and it might ending up taking 6. So regulation or policy approvals or whatever. So if you look at the petroleum use, if you cut that out, you can see 40% of this energy comes from transportation, and of that, 90% or so is from oil. So oil is one of the things, if we're worried about energy security, something that we want to manage. But the US is quite lucky. I think it's the 3rd largest producer of oil in the world, so we've been able to maybe not export a lot of oil, but being close to Canada and so on, we've been fairly lucky in that respect. So, march of progress. So, are we going to change from oil just because the oil runs out? I mean, that's going to take a long time. So what, are we going to give up walking just because somebody invented a wheel? Or, okay, do I have to give up my whale oil lamp, kerosene lamp, now that electricity has been invented? Okay, trucks. So, or what about this guy in his car? What happens when we get an electric vehicle, right? So the next step will happen, and it won't be because we run out of oil. It's because there's extra benefits, right? The car is quiet. The emissions are just water. The material handling, forklifts, these are almost commercially ready, fuel cell forklifts in the US. There's over 3,000 of these forklifts that are on order, I think, with no government support. The US in 2008 put a big grant out during the Recovery Act to help the economy, and there about 1,000 fuel cells were put in place. Industry saw this. These people are working in warehouses where they're getting paid by the 30 seconds. If it takes you 10 minutes to swap out a battery pack and a fuel cell, then you're not going to be able to make as much money. That's what drives anything. And so on a life cycle basis, these fuel cell forklifts are lower cost. So the quadrennial review, this was released in 2011. You can download a copy of it here. This kind of talks about Obama's strategy for where he sees the US going and how are we going to reach these high-level goals. And this was the first time that the Department of Energy had done this. So this is a way for all the different areas to work together. So reducing oil imports by 1/3 by 2025, trying to reach a goal of 80% of electricity being clean energy by 2035, so nuclear power, carbon capture, sequestration, and so on. And the part that I'm most interested in, just given my background, and I think has the chance to have the biggest impact, is this electrifying the vehicle fleet. If you can electrify the vehicle fleet, your efficiency, vehicle efficiency goes way up, and then your fuel use goes down. So whether it's plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles, diesel hybrids, everything's being looked at. So these are the stationary areas. Modernizing the grid is really critical for getting a lot of renewable energy into your grid. And then these are the transport options. So in the US, renewable energy policy is not driven at the federal level. We had a production tax credit for wind that gave maybe 2 cents or so that's going to expire this year. But you have various states here that have really aggressive renewable energy goals. So California has a law that 33% of their electricity needs to come from renewables by 2020. In Germany, that's 35%. And then you can see over here Hawaii, right? It's a miniature version of Japan, maybe. You let your imagination wander. They're trying to get to 40% by 2030. There's a lot of wind, a lot of sun. Diesel electricity costs something like 40 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's competitive with any wind electricity. And at 40 cents a kilowatt hour, you're really close on PV, if not there. And that's just because it's hard to store and transport diesel. Well, it's easy relative to maybe hydrogen, but getting it there over a long distance is costly. So 100 years of natural gas. So switching from renewables, so if we're going to get to these high penetrations, 30, 40% renewable, how are we going to do it? I think natural gas is really key, and not just because it's clean, not because it's cheap, those help, but because it's one of the few fossil fuels that can load follow a renewable energy. So if your solar is going behind a cloud or your wind's not blowing, you have natural gas. You won't get as high a utilization, so the people operating these companies won't have as much money, but it allows you for a clean transition. So that's a good part. So has anybody here read this 100 Years of Natural Gas? It was making a lot of headlines. The International Energy Agency called it the golden age of gas. Has anybody heard about this? There, yeah, you with the tie. No. Okay, so the golden age of natural gas. So maybe 5-10 years ago, the cost of natural gas was, I want to say, $7 a million BTU. Right now, it's the lowest it's been in decades. It's something like $2 a million BTU. So it's dirt cheap relative to where it's been. But I would argue that that's a market anomaly. It's not real and it's not sustainable. A lot of these reserves are overstated. So from this report that was reported in a lot of different areas, they were looking at, what was this? Can I read this? Over 2,000 trillion cubic feet. And that includes speculative, possible, coal bed methane, etc. But when you have a speculative resource, that means, well, maybe it's there, maybe it's not. I mean, we think technology might get there, but it's very, I think, shaky ground to say that you're going to count all of this as available. A second problem is that they chose, and this is probably the biggest problem in that estimate, is the demand was for only 1 year in 2009, 2010, when this report was published. And so when you only have 1 year's demand, of course it'll last a long time. But of course, what's happening, right? Japan has come to the US several times now requesting to import this low-cost natural gas, right? So looking at ways to get this onto an international market, right? You want to make it a fungible commodity, something that can move anywhere. So just because we blockade Iran, does that mean that the price of oil is going to go down or that people won't demand it elsewhere? Once somebody burns oil, it doesn't matter where it came from. Natural gas, because it's a gas, it's hard to transport, so it's hard to move. But when it starts moving to look like gasoline and oil as LNG, it's going to be the same no matter where you are. If whoever's willing to pay the most is the country that will receive that commodity. So demand is going to increase. Some of the other challenges are a lot of these companies that are drilling for this natural gas, what is it, are very small companies. They're called wildcatters. And so they go out around place to place, and they have to take big loans in order to get the equipment, to purchase the land. Once they get that loan, they have to pay it off. And in order to pay it off, they're trying to sell the gas, so that helps. But they have to go and they have to dig to the next well in order to keep selling it. So another problem is that a lot of these places have, I don't know if it's hedged, but they have a contract for, say, $6 a million BTU that lasts for 10 years. So they can keep selling and keep drilling for oil because they're selling at $6 a million BTU because somebody's locked into a contract. But when they start selling at $2 a million BTU, that particular well hole would no longer be profitable. So there's a lot of, I think, discrepancies in how natural gas is calculated and where this market is going. And one last thing is, if you start looking at a transportation shift to natural gas as a fuel, it'll take over 30 years to shift your transportation. By the time you've moved all of your vehicles to run on natural gas instead of oil or whatever else, by then you're going to have a lot less natural gas, and now you have to start all over again to start thinking about electric drive. So natural gas, looking into wind. So renewable energy has been just steadily increased, and it's not quite as exponential as shown in the World Outlook, but you can see over 100 terawatt hours. So this is not capacity factor. This is actual electricity produced. 100 terawatt hours over, what is this, 5 years. So that's 7 nuclear power plants built out over 5 years. I don't know of any country that can do that. If you look at the regulations, the time to get the community buy-off, all of the safety, it just can't be done. Vietnam's looking at putting in a couple of nuclear power reactors from Russia, another couple from Japan. But I think it's going to take them longer than the 4 or 5 years. I think 2015, actually that's closer than that, to get those installed. Wrong way. So renewable energy trends. So over 5 years, the cost of solar power, the tariff that helps them become profitable, has dropped by 50%. So it was something like 50 yen per kilowatt hour. Now it's 25 yen per kilowatt hour. Does anybody know what a feed-in tariff is? A few people? Just raise your hand. I won't call on you, I promise. Okay, I see one person. Anybody else feed-in tariff? Japan's has passed a law last August. It's going to start this July 1st. So a feed-in tariff, this is a way to encourage renewable energy. And what it does is it ensures that somebody who installs renewable energy that's more costly than regular electricity can still receive a 5%, 10% return on that investment. And the way they receive that additional money is everybody who uses electricity pays just 1 or 2 cents that goes into a central fund and then is paid out to these people that were willing to take the risk, though it shouldn't be a risk if it's 5 or 10% return on investment. So in Japan, this law is going to start in July 1st. And right now, the value for the solar energy is something upwards of 50 yen per kilowatt hour. It's higher than anywhere else in the world. And part of the reason is that there's no guaranteed connection. And of course, it's been a real challenge that we have this lost decade in Japan where renewable energy went from 0.5% to 1% as part of the electricity mix. So I think that we'll see a very, very fast spike. And it will probably overheat the market because these tariffs are so high. The wind tariff is something like 20 cents a kilowatt hour. In the US, even with this production tax credit of 2 cents, wholesale wind electricity is 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Now you're telling these people, oh, they can receive 22 yen. So you add the 20% for the difference in the dollar. So what, you're another almost 25 cents a kilowatt hour. You're 3 times the cost of what normal or other places are charging for that wind. So those with large pockets, Son-san Masayoshi, everybody knows who he is, SoftBank, right? He's doing a lot of big solar projects, getting them ready in southern and northern Japan. So right now, yeah, wind is competitive. Good wind right now is competitive with natural gas. In 10 years, it'll probably be competitive with coal. And if you look at solar, that'll be another 10 to 15 years. So again, thinking about how you're locked into energy infrastructure. So targets, how do you get this big renewable energy? It's hard to take that risk. If you don't have a feed-in tariff, you can have aggressive renewable energy targets. And you kind of need both to balance each other out. The government of Scotland's looking at 100%. So part of the UK, they got a lot of offshore wind resources and so on. So they're now contemplating doing 100% of their demand by electricity, renewables, but they're going to keep their nuclear power plants, they're going to keep their coal, natural gas, and they're going to export that additional energy to other parts of Europe. California, we talked about. Denmark is looking at 100% by 2030. I think right now they're at 40, 20% maybe. Germany's looking at 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So energy in Japan, we have 50 gigawatt hours of nuclear power that's been just turned off. Right now, Hashimoto, the mayor, governor from Osaka, he was against the nuclear power plants till somebody twisted his arm, and I think there was a headline just in today's newspaper about him switching, and now all of this public backlash. Why did he change his mind? Though I think he's very political, and he's just neither here nor there. So recently, there was a estimate. Oh, okay. So yeah. So looking at this nuclear power plants, what would it take to replace that? So if you look at the 20% capacity factor on wind, give this 50 gigawatts, 80% capacity factor, you're around 200 gigawatts of wind to replace all of the nuclear power. So a third, 30% of Japan's nuclear or of electricity could come from wind if you had 200 gigawatts of resources. Does Japan have that? Maybe. If you did offshore, the capacity factor increases, and you can see how your nameplate capacity reduces. So you need maybe 130 gigawatts. Right now, there's some big projects going in Fukushima offshore. So MEDI and Marubeni, and I can't remember who the wind manufacturer is, are doing a 15 megawatt project. So they're going to do 2 megawatts this year. They're going to have a large floating barge, and they're going to build up offshore wind just off of where the nuclear power plants were. So looking at this, so MEDI started looking at this resource development. How much was there? And they were fairly pessimistic. They cut it down, right? Is it close to parks? Is it close to residents? Is somebody going to look at it and say they don't like their view got changed or whatever? That dropped from almost 4,000 gigawatts down to 50 because of these problems, not problems, but challenges with regulations for where you can put it. If you go to the environment ministry, they're a little more optimistic, and they said over 320 gigawatts is the total wind energy available in Japan. And so you could see that probably Japan could do 30%, even 60% of their electricity from wind if that was a national priority. So if the same attention from the government had been placed on renewable energy as the last 10 years have been placed on nuclear power, that could probably happen. It'll just take a while. So looking at capacity factor, you can see how the cost changes. So if you run a fossil fuel, a crude oil peaking power plant at 50% capacity factor, you get 22 yen per kilowatt hour. But if you're only using that for 10% capacity factor, so out of 10 hours you're only using it 1, that almost doubles to 35 yen per kilowatt hour. So capacity factor is important when you start thinking about costs. And when you look at a cost comparison chart, you don't always get this background information of how capacity factors were estimated and so on. So I think nuclear power is going to increase in cost. So as you look at the need for more experienced personnel, potentially, having independent decision making. So one of the results of an independent study of kind of the challenges and the problem that happened in 311 last year was that there was a lot of uncertainty, right? Who's going to make the decision? Does it have to go back to METI? Does it go to the Prime Minister? Who makes these big decisions? Do we take everybody out of there and risk a meltdown, or do we leave people there and sacrifice them or whatever? But that independent decision making, the person on the ground has to be able to make the decision. They can't wait for a phone call when you're in the middle of an accident. So METI's response to this, and what I was just reading in the newspaper yesterday, was that they're going to have a video teleconferencing system set up at the power plant and at wherever the leader is, or the Prime Minister or METI, for them to then give feedback. But this is not what the recommendation was. And it's maybe a cultural thing. It's very difficult to, I think a lot of hierarchy is very important in Japan. And so decision making is not happening at somebody who's sitting at a desk. It's happening somebody who's sitting in an office on a top floor somewhere. And so, but that's important if you want, safety is critical. Safety culture, so for a disaster, they mentioned that all the roads in Japan are closed. So if there's an earthquake, you can't get on the freeway. It's going to be reserved for firemen and for policemen. And so the safety culture, that costs money because you have to train people to change what they've done. So have you guys had fire drills here? I know I had to do it in elementary school, but right, safety is something that it's hard to quantify, but that's going to increase costs. So this is a Japanese slide from a couple months ago, and you can look at how the green is the nuclear power, red is the Karyoku Hatsuden, fossil fuel generation, and the blue is renewable or water power. And you can see before and after, so this is Kyushu, before and after the earthquake, right, all the nuclear power is shut down. So they've had 30% of the energy has been just turned off, and it's had to be made up by fossil fuels. This is the wind energy estimate that I talked about. Ushiyama-san put this together. He has a really good presentation. JREF is Son-san's renewable energy lobbying agency. So he's done quite a few conferences where there's a lot of information about renewable energy. But you can see all of the energy, wind energy, offshore wind energy in Hokkaido. There's a lot down here south. But how do you get it to the center of the country? So you can either do high voltage lines where you have to ask everybody's backyard, every prefecture where it crosses the border, can I dig up your backyard, or can I put an immense tower here? Or you can maybe, I'm hoping to work with Iwatani and some folks at Netto, look at what would the cost be of liquefying hydrogen from this wind energy here and moving it down to population demand centers. I think if you're going to run that through a fuel cell, it just won't work. But if you can start thinking about transportation, that cost could be doable. especially if you're looking at high capacity factors and you're looking at 10 cents, 10 yen or a kilowatt hour or less. Because you can use that. You get 100% utilization because any wind energy that's produced doesn't have to be curtailed. It doesn't have to be turned off. It can be fed into that liquefier or electrolyzer. This is a slide showing J-Power's kind of transmission lines. So I'm going to be spending a couple months there for the last 2 months of my fellowship in their planning department. But you can see they have some transmission lines here in Hokkaido. Their renewable energy or water power is the highest of any of the 10 traditional renewable energy or electric power companies, close to what TEPCO has. There's several energy committees now happening in Japan. So this General Advisory Committee, Sogyo Shigen Engi Chogu Sakai. So in the basement of METI, every month, twice a month, they have a meeting from 6 to 10 p.m. And they have these 25 people from universities, from Japanese industry, from various consumer groups come and talk about what is the best mix. So you have, anybody know who Ida Tetsunari is? Ida Tetsunari is a renewable energy samurai. No. So he's a big advocate for renewable energy. So there's one side that is we need to do renewable energy. Another side is, well, let's see what we can do to bring the nuclear power plants online. And there hasn't been much compromise. And so I think this committee was tasked with coming up with a final report where they all agreed on what's the best mix for the next 30, 50 years. Where is Japan going to go for its energy priorities? But I think it will come out with 2 versions, and it will be very hard to unify given the personalities on this panel. The MPU, National Policy Unit, they had a cost comparison where they were looking at what's the cost of various fuels. I have a chart a little bit later. But it's interesting. They talk about wind electricity, and after 20 years of development, they said the cost came down 1 yen per kilowatt hour. So it seemed to be fairly pessimistic, but I couldn't read the whole report. And then we have the feed-in tariffs. So I talked about this PV, 42 yen, wind 23. Oh, and then the big challenge is no guaranteed grid connection, which is generally one of the cornerstone elements of feed-in tariff. And then generators must pay all connection costs. Again, it's up to the utility to pay for the connection in Germany. So I think it'll be interesting, very interesting to see what happens with renewable energy come July. So this is the MPU's cost comparison. The gray bar here is from 2004. They have 2010 and then 2030. So you can see how nuclear power, the cost is not quite doubled, but there's still some uncertainty, right? What's it going to cost to clean up and compensation for people that have had to move and so on. You can see here, this is Seikitan, Kaseki Nenyo. So this is the coal-powered electricity. And then you can see LNG costs as well. This here is the wind costs, so onshore, offshore. But these costs are coming down rapidly. There's a lot of research and development happening in Europe. UK's planning, I think, a 300 and some odd megawatt offshore wind farm. There was a recent announcement of a joint cooperation between DOE and UK Department of Energy. So looking at Japan's oil demand, so you have those different electricity generation sources. The other side is transportation and industry, just seeing where's that oil go. So is there going to be competition for electricity generation? So you can see since 1970 to 2008, the percentage that has gone to transportation is almost doubled. And then if you look at the generation by fuel, again, you can see there's still 30% of oil is being burned to produce electricity. It's very expensive, not terribly clean. I think in the 1970s, California, early 80s, outlawed the use of oil for producing electricity. It's too dirty, too expensive. But it's still happening in Japan, and probably even more so with the nuclear power not being available. So alternative transportation. Right now, there's a lot of interest in electric vehicles. So we have the Leaf, IMEV. I think it's got a different name here by Mitsubishi. You can see here from Toyota's estimate, if you look at how much the cost of gasoline would have to be versus the cost of hydrogen, if you're on the lower half of this chart, hydrogen would be cheaper than the operating costs of a conventional hybrid vehicle or gasoline vehicle. So you can see here, if your gasoline is around 140, 150 yen, your hydrogen would have to be around 800 yen gurai per kilogram. And if you look at April, the cost of gasoline in Japan was 150 yen per liter. And you can see in Germany, they have a big incentive to move to hydrogen, and that's where you see a lot of the efforts to develop hydrogen refueling stations. So you can see they're almost 180 yen per liter of gasoline. So if you're over here, your hydrogen can be almost $10, $12 a kilogram, and you're still better off using hydrogen. So these are all the power plants in Japan. A lot of the concerns about renewable energy is, well, how are we going to transport that? We have to build transmission, or just can't be done. But if you look at all these power plants that need big cooling, that's going to have an electricity transmission line. So if you're doing offshore wind, if you line this up where these old power plants are with where potential wind resources are, you have half of your cost already taken care of for renewable energy. If you're just paying the capital cost to do big renewable energy, you just have to piggyback on these locations. If you look at the green squares, that's where the nuclear power plants are. So again, you're going to have a lot of transmission capacity. And more importantly, these blue triangles are the pumped hydro. So if you have renewable energy at these green boxes, you can move that just like the nuclear power is being moved at night up into that pumped hydro and then be used during the day. So you don't worry about the variability in those renewables. It's just like a nuclear power plant that you can't turn off. You have a variable renewable. They both have their own challenges that are fixed with storage. So if nuclear power is 30% of your output, on average, maybe at night when nobody's using it, 10% of a nation's electricity can still be used. So at night, 20% of the electricity had to go somewhere from those nuclear power plants, and it was to this pumped hydro. So these are a recent paper from 2010 that shows the number of megawatts of pumped hydro. And you can see Japan, lots of mountains, lots of rain, so they have a lot of resources. It's hard to build out more, but if this pumped hydro is primarily being used for nuclear power, maybe some of that's freed up if you can switch off some of the fossil fuels. And that's how they've been able to make that shift from shutting down all the nuclear power plants, is running all the fossil plants at night. So strong grid, you can see Japan's grid is this prod structure. In Europe, it's a mesh structure. So when you have renewable energy that's going up and down, you need to be able to move that quickly between regions. And then you also have the additional challenge of the losses and the cost of the 60 hertz and 50 hertz. So there's advantages to having these small regional control areas. It's a higher efficiency for the generation plants because they can plan just for that small region. There's low electric losses because your transmission's much shorter because you're using your power at the same place. Easy to control and manage, but there's a lot of difficulties, and kind of the final one is it's hard to bring in renewable energy because you don't have a strong grid. In Germany, you can see where those resources are, where the transmission lines are in between. Makes it very easy for somebody who's thinking about the future of energy. Where's your resources? How are you going to move it? So I like this example to talk about that. Market externalities, I'm not going to go into that. Everybody knows about why it's been so hard to change. Barriers. We have economic barriers. They're all very linked. So common elements, you want it to be easy to understand your policy so people know what they're working towards. 20% renewable energy, by 2020, 20% less greenhouse gases, 20% more efficient. That's an easy story. It's easy for people to understand. If you look at the policy implementation time, we talked about this. It takes a long time to get stuff passed through the Diet. And fossil fuel, nuclear power, these plants last a long time. Europe's already planning for their transition from 2020 to their 2050 energy plan. They've all worked out where the challenges are going to be. They have it written for 2050. They have it written for 2020. Where do they want to go? Now they're thinking about what are the challenges to transition between those plans. How do we make it happen faster? How do we make it happen more efficiently? Biofuels are coming under a lot of scrutiny because their sustainability, opportunity costs, land use, and so on. So the last question is, can you build your economy? I mean, can you make jobs from renewable energy? That renewable energy is a lot less dense. You can have a nuclear power plant that goes into a small area the size of a school, and you can have 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what you're paying. You can have wind energy. So even if the wind is 10, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, you're getting the same amount of electricity, but now instead of that, all of that money going to one concrete company, that money is going to spread out to all of these different areas where people are going to be installing these wind towers. It's going to be very spread out through a region rather than just one small locality that receives all of that government aid and support, or just the funding, the economic development. So 200,000 jobs in 2010. They're estimating this to go up to 500,000 jobs, and this is this 20% renewable energy target, and this is for Europe. So this is the European Wind Energy Association. Their chart is here. But there's a lot of investment going into R&D, more than any other industries for wind. So I think wind costs are going to really come down in Europe. And then they'll be able to export that, which will then further drive kind of the GDP benefit. So I apologize for going over. I'm now 20 minutes over, 25, but thank you very much.